The school bell echoed through the hallway. Mike, a senior high school student, lazily stuffed his books into his bag and headed towards his next class. The autumn air seeped through the half-open windows, bringing with it the scent of dry leaves. But there was something in the air that felt different from usual, a sense of unease that Mike couldn't quite describe. As he passed by the principal's office, he caught snippets of a tense, agitated conversation. Mike stopped and listened intently. "We need to lock down the school right now. He's out there, and he's coming here." Mike's heart raced. It was the voice of Ms. Rezai, the school principal, speaking in panic. Another voice, which seemed to belong to Mr. Mohammadi, the vice principal, replied, "Calm down. We shouldn't scare the children. We need to act with caution." Mike felt as if an icy hand had gripped his heart. Who was out there? What danger was threatening them? Suddenly the school intercom crackled to life, startling everyone. "Attention! Attention! All students and staff, please proceed immediately to the nearest classroom and lock the doors. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill." Chaos ensued. Students ran in all directions, terrified. Mike, still in shock, pressed himself against the wall to stay safe. Screams and shouts could be heard from every direction. Amidst the chaos, Mike's eyes fell on Sarah, a girl he had secretly admired for months. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, unsure of what to do. Without hesitation, Mike ran towards her and grabbed her hand. "Come on, we need to find a safe place." They both ran towards the nearest classroom. As they entered, they saw the math teacher, Mr. Ahmadi, with a pale face, locking the door. "Hurry, children. Come in and be quiet." Mike and Sarah huddled in a corner of the classroom. About 20 other students were there too, all terrified and anxious. Mr. Ahmadi, with a trembling voice, said, "Everyone stay calm. I'm sure everything will be fine. We just need to." His words were cut off by the sound of breaking glass from the hallway. Everyone jumped. Heavy footsteps could be heard from outside. Mike felt his heart was about to burst out of his chest. Sarah was trembling beside him. Mr. Ahmadi put his finger to his lips, urging everyone to remain silent. The footsteps grew closer and closer. Now they were right outside the classroom door. Everyone held their breath. Suddenly, the door handle shook violently. Someone, or something, was trying to get in. Mike held Sarah's hand tighter. Mr. Ahmadi stared at the door in horror. The scratching and banging on the door continued. At any moment, the door could be torn off its hinges. Mike knew he had to do something, but what? Just then, the sound of police sirens could be heard from outside. The banging on the door stopped, and the sound of running footsteps echoed down the hallway. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, but they knew they weren't safe yet. Mike looked around, and an idea struck him. "Mr. Ahmadi," he whispered, "look at that window. We could escape through there." The teacher glanced at the window and nodded. "Good idea, Mike. But we need to make sure it's safe outside." Mike volunteered. "I'll go and check." Sarah grabbed his hand worriedly. "Mike, it's dangerous." Mike smiled and said, "Don't worry. I promise I'll be careful." He quietly moved towards the window and pulled back at the curtain. The school's backyard seemed empty, but just as he was about to tell the others that the coast was clear, he saw a shadow emerge from the corner of the building. A man in dark clothes with a mask on his face, holding a knife, was approaching the window. Mike quickly dropped the curtain and turned back to the others. "Someone's coming. We need to find another way." Panic gripped the classroom once again. Mr. Ahmadi tried to calm everyone down. but he was scared too. Mike racked his brain. He had to find a way out. His eyes fell on the closet at the back of the classroom. Maybe we can get to the next classroom through there. With the help of a few others, they moved the closet. Behind it was a small hatch that seemed to lead to the space between two classrooms. Mike went in first. The space was tight and dark, but passable. Come on, one by one, get through. One by one, they crawled through the hatch. Just as the last person, Mr. Ahmadi, was about to enter, they heard the main classroom door being broken down. The intruder had entered the classroom. Mike, now in the adjacent classroom, peeked through a crack in the door. The hallway seemed empty. I think we can get out from here. But just as they were about to open the door, a scream echoed from the hallway. It was Miss Rezai's voice. Help! Someone help! Mike knew he couldn't leave the school principal behind. He looked at Sarah and said, I'm going to help her. You take the others outside. Sarah said worriedly, No, Mike. It's too dangerous. Mike smiled and said, Don't worry. I promise I'll come back. Before anyone could stop him, he went out the door. The hallway was dark and quiet. Miss Rezai's moans were coming from her office. Mike quietly approached the office. The door was half open. Through the gap, he could see Miss Rezai lying on the floor. But there was no sign of the intruder. He cautiously entered the office. Miss Rezai, are you okay? The principal, seeing Mike, said in horror, Mike, get out, he's still here. Before Mike could react, a heavy blow struck the back of his head. Everything went black. When he regained consciousness, he found himself tied to a chair. Miss Rezai was also tied up next to him. A masked man stood in front of them. Finally awake, little hero, the man said, mockingly. Mike tried to loosen the ropes, but they were tied tightly. What do you want? Why are you doing this? The man laughed. Why? Because this school took something that belonged to me. Now it's time for you to pay, Ms. Rezai said with a trembling voice. You must be James, that expelled student. The man took off his mask. A young but angry face was revealed. Well done. You still remember. Did you think you could ruin my life and get away with it? Mike was confused. What happened? What's going on? James smirked and started pacing around the room. 3 years ago, I was a student at this school. I had the best grades. I was supposed to get a scholarship and go to the best university. But one day, his voice filled with anger. One day, this dear Ms. Rezai accused me of cheating, said I cheated on the final exam, without any evidence, just because one of the teachers was suspicious. Ms. Rezai tried to speak. James, we had to investigate. The rules. Shut up, James shouted. Rules? Which rules? The ones that ruined my life. You expelled me. I lost my scholarship. No university would accept me. I lost 3 years of my life. Mike tried to stay calm and think. He knew he had to find a way to save them. With a voice he tried to keep steady, he said, James, I understand how much you've been hurt, but this isn't the way. You can still make everything right. James sneered and came towards Mike. Make it right? How? I've lost 3 of the best years of my life. Nothing can bring those back. At that moment, the sound of police sirens grew closer. James angrily went to the window and looked outside. Damn it, the police are coming in. Mike seized the opportunity. James, it's not too late. You can surrender. If you end this now, maybe you can get another chance. Ms. Rezai also said with a trembling voice, James, I'm sorry. Maybe we made a mistake. If you were really innocent, I promise I'll help you get justice." James hesitated for a moment. It seemed their words had an effect. But suddenly the sound of breaking glass came from the hallway. The police were entering the building. James shouted angrily, "No, I won't let them catch me again," and ran towards the door. Mike, who had been working on untying his ropes all this time, finally managed to free his hand. Just as James was about to leave the room, Mike threw himself at him and grabbed his legs. James fell face first onto the floor. Mike quickly jumped on him and tried to restrain him. "Help! We're here!" The sound of rapid footsteps came from the hallway. Seconds later, 2 police officers entered the office and arrested James. Mike, breathing heavily, went to Ms. Rezai and untied her ropes. "Are you okay?" Ms. Rezai nodded with tearful eyes. "Thank you, Mike. You're a real hero." In the hours that followed, the school was taken out of lockdown. Students and teachers, shocked but safe, left the building. Families were anxiously waiting to embrace their loved ones. Mike, with a blanket draped over his shoulders, was talking to his parents when Sarah ran towards him and hugged him tightly. "Mike, thank God you're safe. When I heard what happened, I was going crazy with worry." Mike smiled and said, "Don't worry. It's all over now." In the days that followed, Mike was hailed as the school hero. But for him, the most important thing was that everyone was safe. Ms. Rezai, affected by this incident, decided to review the system for handling student violations. She even promised to re-examine James's case to ensure justice had been served. Mike, despite everything that had happened, felt he had learned a lot. He realized that sometimes courage isn't about standing up to danger, but about trying to understand and help others, even those who might have made mistakes. At the end of the school year, the school held a ceremony to honor Mike's bravery and other students who had kept their cool on that difficult day. As Mike received his award, he thought about how an ordinary day can quickly turn into something that changes everyone's lives. He had learned that life is full of surprises, but with courage, empathy, and intelligence, one can overcome even the toughest situations. And perhaps most importantly, he had realized that everyone, even in their darkest moments, deserves a second chance. The school bell echoed through the courtyard. John, a senior high school student, reluctantly woke up. He glanced at the clock and jumped out of bed when he saw it was 7:30 a.m. He was late. Hurriedly, he put on his clothes and grabbed his bag. His mother called from the kitchen, "John, you haven't had breakfast." "I'm late, Mom. I'll grab something on the way," John shouted back as he rushed out of the house. The cold autumn air hit his face. Yellow and orange leaves crunched under his feet. John ran towards the school with long strides. His mind was preoccupied with the math test he had today, for which he had studied late into the night. When he arrived at school, the yard was almost empty. Most students had already gone to their classes. John took a deep breath and entered the building. The hallways seemed strangely quiet. When he reached his classroom, he opened the door and apologized as he entered. But he was met with an unexpected scene. The class was empty. No teacher, no students. Only bags and open books on the desks. John looked around in confusion. What's going on here? Is it a holiday and I didn't know? Suddenly, a scream echoed from the hallway. John turned towards the door in fear. His heart was racing. The sound of running and muffled screams came from outside. He cautiously stepped out of the classroom. The hallway was engulfed in a deathly silence. John called out, "Is anyone here? What's happening?" The sound of footsteps came from behind him. He turned around in terror and saw his friend Ali, pale and breathless, running towards him. "John, thank God I found you. We need to get out of here immediately. The school is in danger." "What happened, Ali? Why has everyone disappeared?" Ali said with a trembling voice. "Someone has entered the school. They're armed. They've threatened everyone. Some have been taken hostage." John felt as if his heart had stopped. "What? I can't believe it. We need to call the police." Ali shook his head. "They've collected all the mobile phones. No one can make a call. For now, we need to hide until..." His words were cut short by the sound of a gunshot from the floor below. John and Ali looked at each other in horror. "Run! We need to find a safe place." John grabbed Ali's hand, and they both ran towards the end of the hallway. The sound of screams and crying came from the floor below. John's heart was pounding. He couldn't believe that an ordinary school day had turned into such a nightmare. As they searched for a hiding place, John thought about how he could help his friends and classmates. He didn't know what fate awaited them, but he was determined not to give up. John and Ali cautiously moved through the empty and frightening corridors of the school. Every sound made them jump. Their hearts were beating so fast it felt like they might burst out of their chests. "We need to go upstairs," John whispered. "Maybe we can call for help from a window." Ali nodded hesitantly. "What if they see us? We don't know how many there are or where they are." The sound of footsteps came from the stairs. John and Ali looked at each other in horror. John quickly pulled Ali's hand, and they both entered the bathroom. They hid in one of the stalls and held their breath. The footsteps got closer and closer. The voice of a strange man was heard. "Search everywhere. No one should escape." John felt like his heart was about to jump out of his mouth. Ali was trembling beside him. The sound of doors opening and closing could be heard. The man was checking each stall one by one. Suddenly, a phone rang loudly. John reached into his pocket in terror. He had forgotten to turn off his phone. With shaking hands, he tried to turn it off, but it was too late. The stall door burst open. A man with a black mask and a gun in his hand stared at them with angry eyes. "Come out," the man shouted in a harsh voice. John and Ali fearfully came out of the stall. The man had his gun pointed at them. "Did you think you could hide? Now you're coming with me." The man led them towards the hallway. John's mind was racing. He had to find a way to escape. He glanced at Ali, who was pale and shaking. In the hallway, they were confronted with a heartbreaking scene. Several students and teachers were sitting on the floor, watched over by two other armed men. John spotted his friend Reza among the hostages, but there was no sign of Sarah and Mariam, two of his close friends. Worry consumed him. Where were they? What had happened to them? The armed man forced them to sit with the others. John tried to stay calm and think. He had to find a way to save themselves and the others. One of the men, who seemed to be the leader, came forward and said, "Now that we're all gathered here, I'd better explain the rules to you. Anyone who tries to escape or call for help will be shot without warning. Understood?" Everyone nodded fearfully. John looked around. The windows were closed, and the armed men were watching all the exits. Suddenly, the sound of police sirens was heard from outside. The faces of the armed men darkened. The leader shouted angrily, "Who called them?" John felt a glimmer of hope in his heart. Maybe they still had a chance for rescue, but he knew that the situation would become even more dangerous. Hours passed slowly. John and the other hostages sat in silence and terror. The sound of police negotiations could be heard from outside the building, but the armed men showed no inclination to surrender. John's mind was working overtime. Why had this happened? What was in this ordinary school that was worth all this risk? Suddenly, one of the armed men went to the leader and whispered something in his ear. The leader's face contorted and he angrily said, "How haven't you found it yet? Have you searched everywhere?" John pricked up his ears. They were looking for something. But what? At that moment, his eyes fell on their physics teacher, Mr. Mohammadi. The color had drained from his face, and he kept looking at his watch. His behavior seemed suspicious. John leaned towards Reza, who was sitting next to him, and whispered, "Do you think Mr. Mohammadi knows something?" Reza glanced briefly at their teacher and nodded. "Yeah, he's been acting really strange since this all started." John's mind started working. Maybe Mr. Mohammadi was the key to solving this puzzle. But how could he talk to him? Suddenly, a scream was heard from the hallway. One of the armed men violently pushed a girl into the room. John's breath caught when he saw the familiar face of the girl. It was Sarah. Sarah joined the group of hostages with tear-filled eyes and a bruised face. John asked worriedly, "Sarah, what happened? Where were you?" Sarah, with a trembling voice and eyes full of tears, said, "When I heard the gunshot, Mariam and I ran. We tried to get out through the lab window, but..." Her voice broke and she burst into sobs. John asked anxiously, "Where's Mariam? What happened to her?" Sarah lowered her head and continued in a voice that was barely audible. "When we were climbing down from the window, one of those men saw us. He shot at us. Mariam fell." John felt as if his heart had stopped. "No, this can't be." Sarah continued crying. "I ran and hid in the old school storage room, but they finally found me." John tried to control himself. He couldn't believe that Mariam... No, even thinking about it was painful. But now he had to focus on saving the others. At that moment, the leader's shout caught everyone's attention. "Time's up. If our demands aren't met within an hour, we'll kill one hostage every half hour." Terror washed over everyone's faces. John glanced at Mr. Mohammadi, who was now completely pale and sweating profusely. John made his decision. He had to talk to Mr. Mohammadi. He slowly moved towards his teacher and whispered, "Mr. Mohammadi, you know what they're looking for, don't you?" Mr. Mohammadi looked at John fearfully and nodded. "John, listen. In the lab, behind the big cabinet, there's a hidden safe. The password is the school's founding date. Take whatever is inside and give it to the police. Just be careful." His words were cut off by the sound of a gunshot. Mr. Mohammadi fell to the ground. Blood flowed from his chest. John stared at the scene in horror. The group leader shouted angrily, "I said anyone who talks unnecessarily dies." Now John knew he had little time. He had to get to the lab somehow. But how? John put his mind to work. He had to find a way to get to the lab. He looked around, and his eyes fell on the fire extinguisher in the corner of the room. He carefully signaled to Ali and Reza and explained his plan to them. They nodded, scared but determined. John took a deep breath and suddenly shouted, "Fire! The room is on fire!" Everyone looked around in panic. At that moment, Ali grabbed the fire extinguisher and sprayed it towards the armed men. Reza turned off the lights. In the chaos and darkness, John took the opportunity and ran towards the door. He could hear shouts and gunshots behind him, but he just kept running. The corridors were silent and dark. John ran towards the lab with all his might. His heart was beating so hard, it felt like it would burst out of his chest. When he reached the lab, he opened the door and went inside. He hurried to the big cabinet and tried to move it. The cabinet was heavy, but with great effort, he finally managed to push it aside. Behind the cabinet, just as Mr. Mohammadi had said, there was a hidden safe. With trembling hands, John entered the school's founding date. There was a clicking sound, and the safe door opened. Inside the safe was a red folder and an external hard drive. John quickly took them and put them in his bag. The sound of footsteps could be heard from the corridor. John knew he had little time. He quickly went to the window and opened it. Fortunately, the lab was on the first floor. John jumped out of the window and started running. He could hear shouts and gunshots behind him, but he just kept running. When he reached the main street, he saw police cars. "Help! I escaped from the school," John shouted with all his might. The police quickly came towards him and took him to a safe place. John, breathless, said, "In the school, hostage situation. You need to save them." Then he opened his bag and handed the folder and hard drive to the police. I think these are what they were looking for. Hours later, the police operation ended successfully. The hostage takers were arrested, and the rest of the students and teachers were rescued. But this wasn't the end of the story. The contents of the folder and hard drive revealed a shocking secret. It turned out that the school had been the site of illegal and dangerous experiments for years. Mr. Mohammadi, the physics teacher, was actually an undercover agent who had infiltrated the school to gather evidence. The hostage takers were members of a secret organization that wanted to keep these secrets hidden. They were willing to commit any crime to do so. As John heard these truths, he felt like the world was spinning around him. He couldn't believe that the school he had attended for years had such dark secrets. But among all this shocking news, another piece of information caught John's attention. Mariam was alive. She had been injured and was hospitalized, but she was alive. John, along with Sarah and Reza, went to visit Mariam in the hospital. When they saw her lying on the bed, tears welled up in their eyes. Mariam smiled weakly when she saw her friends and said, "I thought I'd never see you again." John took Mariam's hand and said, "We'll always be together, no matter what happens." Months passed since that terrifying day. The school was closed for a while, and extensive investigations were carried out. Many school officials and individuals involved in the illegal experiments were arrested. John and his friends tried to return to normal life, but they knew they could never forget that day. That experience had made them stronger and closer to each other. A year later, on the anniversary of that day, John, Sarah, Reza, and Mariam gathered together. They lit a candle in memory of Mr. Mohammadi and the other victims of that day. John looked at his friends and said, "We survived that day, but we lost a lot. Let's promise to always pursue the truth and never allow something like this to happen again." Everyone nodded and promised. They knew that their lives had changed forever, but they were determined to use this experience to build a better future. And as the sun set, the four friends walked out of the park together, ready to face any challenge that life might put in their way.